Saludos clase, ¿cómo están ustedes? Primero, muchas gracias a todos los participantes en la actividad de The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I always really enjoy reading the expressions that you come up with to look up, and your search results as well, which always range from surprisingly accurate to laughably terrible. So this video is going to be a roundup of your observations, but first I want to point out some good habits that this activity was trying to call your attention to in order to get the best results from your web translators. First, it's important to read deep into your search results. A lot of folks gave me el tiempo o la hora when asked to report on the word for time in Spanish. But the word for time gave me around a dozen different translations on word reference and on SpanishDict.com and Google as well, as long as you're prepared to keep scrolling through your search results. Second, it's important to reverse translate. So if you put your word back through the translator, does it preserve the meaning that you intended? Even if it's literally correct, are you confident that break a leg actually means break a leg in Spanish? Thirdly, it's important to know what part of speech you're translating. Think about hang out from our activity. It can be a verb, a noun, or, as one student pointed out, even an adjective. So knowing which one helps you both to sift through your results and to use your word correctly in context. Fourthly, you must spell your word correctly in English. When you give Google something it doesn't recognize at all, you're going to get back exactly the same thing. We can call this the b-ball effect, and it can give you a false sense of security in your search results. You might look at that and say, it turns out that b-ball is just b-ball in Spanish, when in fact you got b-ball because Google didn't know what to do with the input that you gave it. Now let's move on to our course policy for web translation. A lot of you stopped short of making practical recommendations for what our course policy should be, but I will say that your perspectives were vital to me in identifying a couple of gaps between how I as a teacher and you as students perceive and use web translators. So I want you to know that I really took your observations to heart as I developed and fleshed out my expectations for the semester. So here's an example of a gap between how I perceive and use web translators and how students seem to perceive and use them. Web translation apps are okay to use to check your work. This was revealing to me. I actually find it heartening that students are using web translation software this way, although it can be hard for me to tell at what stage in the process you're using translation. If I never see what you could come up with on your own, it kind of takes me out of the equation when it comes to knowing whether the things that we're doing in class are making sense to you. And, as another student pointed out, web translators can just completely mess up what they were trying to say in the first place. Maybe your answer was correct, but the algorithm is only ever going to give you one search result. So now, suddenly, the tool you were trying to use to boost your self-confidence just told you you were wrong, when your way was actually fine. So let's talk about some of the student responses that proposed some practical guidelines for our class. I heard everything from no policy, swim at your own risk, to no translation software ever. But these responses were especially well aligned with my own philosophy. You can't learn a language if the website does all the work for you. Right. Speaking a language is like applying any skill. There's a huge difference between understanding how something's done and being able to execute it yourself. And you can't outsource your practice and expect learning to happen. Another student was right on the money from my perspective when he said, I would rather my students make honest mistakes that I could assist them with and help them grow than rely on the translation apps. It breaks my heart when students don't feel safe making mistakes in my class. I always wonder whether it's me that the person doesn't trust or themselves. And it makes it harder for me to know whether I'm an effective teacher when students focus on turning something in that's correct rather than something that's authentic. So what's our takeaway? Should we use web translators? Should we not? Are there ways that we should use them and ways that we shouldn't? Well, I liked this statement. The students should try to get as far as they can without the use of translation websites. I've worked really hard to structure your assignments in this class so that you can express yourself with only the tools that you've encountered so far in your learning and to give you chances to apply what we're working on right now. So if you find that you don't have the grammar or vocab to say what you're trying to say, sometimes that's a sign that you just need to simplify and refocus on what the activity is actually about. This is especially true in practice activities, where there's usually something very precise that I want you to be working on. Web translators have a way of doing an end run on those specific skills, and they can take a great opportunity to try out a new concept and turn it into empty busy work, just like that. So use them sparingly and with caution seems like a great principle to me. Several of you pointed out that these apps are very useful for individual vocab items and not very useful at all for whole sentences or paragraphs. Treat them as a souped-up dictionary and you can't go wrong. Although, if I give you a vocab list, there's generally a reason that I chose to use the word that I did, so please make that your first resource. We can't have a meaningful conversation about this without talking about potential consequences. And in the words of one student, if the use gets too blatant and extends past general assistance, there should be repercussions in place. And I generally agree with this statement. The truth is that I won't always be able to detect web translation or able to gauge how students are using these tools, and frankly, I don't consider that the best use of my time or yours, to play cat and mouse with you about web translation. I would prefer to just trust you to use these tools responsibly. But that doesn't mean that my trust can't be broken. Which is why, if I see a pattern of web translation, whether it's on an individual assignment or across multiple assignments of yours, I may award you a grade of 0 for a task and invite you to reattempt the activity. It's pretty simple. Apply your skills, improve your fluency, pass the class. I want to wrap this up with one final observation from a student who said, there will always be students who cheat. I mean, yes, but in my experience, students very rarely set out to cheat. In general, students who turn to web translators don't do it because they're lazy or dishonest. More often than not, they're good, motivated students who feel anxiety when they get wrong answers, or they reach a point where they feel like they're just in over their heads. I just hope that in that moment, instead of relying on web translation, you'll take a step back, reevaluate what it is that you're trying to do, what it is that I, as your instructor, am hoping you will do, and that you'll also take a moment to reach out to me and say, hey, I'm in the weeds. I could use some help understanding this concept. The long and short of it is that I hope that you'll trust that mistakes are a part of your learning process, that you'll trust me and your peers enough to let us see your mistakes, and finally, that you will trust that there is a direct through line between applying your skills, improving your fluency, and being successful in Spanish 203. Hasta pronto. Because the things that you come up to look with, so knowing which one helps you both sift through your results. Nope. Now, as we move on to talk, I'd like to move on. Next, I'd like to talk about if the use gets too blatant mistakes that I could assist them with. So I hope that I'd like to move on.